The retirement committee reserved just 16 folding chairs. That seemed generous for a 79-year-old park groundskeeper who had spent 27 years quietly mowing lawns, repairing benches, trimming trees, and politely avoiding attention. Rachel Morgan had expected a handful of co-workers, 2 city officials, and perhaps 1 or 2 retired volunteers. Instead, before sunrise on the morning of Samuel Carter's retirement, she looked across the entrance road to Riverside Memorial Park and watched a line of unfamiliar cars stretching nearly half a mile beyond the main gate. They kept coming. Families, veterans, young parents, adults carrying faded photographs, children holding handwritten letters. No one on the committee recognized most of them. The questions spread through the park faster than the morning fog. Who were they all here to thank? If you've ever wondered whether quiet service is remembered long after applause fades, stay with me. I did not know any of this was happening. At that hour, I was doing exactly what I had done almost every morning since accepting the groundskeeper position 27 years earlier. I walked the Eastern Trail before anyone else arrived. Habit told me to notice the little things: a loose board on the footbridge, a sprinkler head sitting slightly too high, fresh claw marks on an oak where raccoons had spent the night. Most visitors never realized the park stayed beautiful because someone found small problems before they became large ones. That was always enough for me. I carried the same canvas maintenance bag I had used for years. Inside were pruning shears, work gloves, a small notebook, a screwdriver polished smooth by decades of use, and 1 old pair of children's work gloves that had never quite fit anyone. I had kept them anyway. Some habits refuse retirement. As I reached the playground, I noticed 1 swing chain squeaking softly. Most people would never hear it. I did. 10 minutes later, the chain moved silently again. No report filed, no work order, no audience. Exactly the way I preferred it. When I finally returned to the maintenance workshop, Rachel stood outside pretending to organize flower pots. She smiled a little too brightly. "Good morning, Sam." "Morning. Big day." "I suppose so." She handed me a paper cup of coffee. "You don't have to work today." "I know." I glanced toward the tool rack. "But the park doesn't." She laughed despite herself. "I had a feeling you'd say that." For weeks she had tried convincing me to let someone else prepare everything for the retirement gathering. For weeks I had quietly ignored the suggestion. If people were coming, they deserved clean picnic tables and freshly edged walkways, not because they were celebrating me, because that was simply how Riverside should look. While tightening the last loose bolt on a picnic bench, I noticed something unusual. Several strangers stood near the entrance pavilion, holding large envelopes against their chests. They weren't city employees. They weren't park volunteers. 1 elderly Marine in a dress jacket carried a framed photograph. A young mother held the hand of a little boy wearing gardening gloves several sizes too large. Neither of them approached me. They simply looked around the park, as though remembering something deeply personal. Rachel followed my gaze. "You know them?" I shook my head. "No." She hesitated before answering. "That's what worries me." Before I could ask what she meant, another line of vehicles slowly entered the park, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, I looked across the grounds I had quietly cared for and realized hundreds of people were somehow gathering for reasons I did not yet understand. The first unfamiliar families arrived before 8:30. By 9 o'clock, they had quietly spread throughout Riverside Memorial Park, as though each person already knew exactly where they wanted to stand. Some walked slowly along the flower gardens. Others paused beside the old playground. A few veterans gathered beneath the flagpole without speaking, simply watching the maintenance paths where I had spent most of my mornings. None of them came looking for me. That puzzled me more than anything else. If this gathering truly celebrated my retirement, why did everyone seem more interested in remembering the park than finding the man who had cared for it? Rachel Morgan noticed the same thing. She quietly joined me beneath the maintenance workshop. They aren't acting like guests. No, they're acting like they're coming home. I looked across the grounds again. A middle-aged couple stood beside the smallest maple tree in the children's garden, smiling through tears. Two young women photographed an old wooden bench near the duck pond. An elderly veteran carefully ran his hand across the railing of a bridge I had rebuilt years earlier after spring flooding. Everywhere I looked, strangers seemed to recognize place I had almost forgotten. Rachel held a clipboard crowded with new names. We planned for 16 people. Looks like we missed the estimate. She gave a nervous laugh. We're past 200. And they're still calling. I frowned gently. Calling? She nodded. They keep asking if they're too late. For what? To thank you. The words landed awkwardly between us. I had never been comfortable with gratitude directed toward me. The park deserves thanks. Rachel smiled knowingly. You've been saying that for 27 years. Because it's true. Before she could answer, David Brooks walked toward us. David had served in the Army years after I left the Corps of Engineers and had volunteered in the park almost every Saturday since retiring. He carried an old tackle box instead of his usual gardening tools. You'll need to see this. He opened the lid. Inside lay dozens of faded photographs, not organized by year, organized by location: the North Trail, the Butterfly Garden, the playground, the Memorial Grove, children planting trees, teenagers painting picnic tables, families rebuilding flower beds. Every photograph included different people. Only one person appeared in every single picture. Me. Usually in the background, holding a shovel, repairing a fence, teaching someone how to use a wrench, picking up trash while everyone else smiled toward the camera. I didn't even know these existed. David nodded. That's because nobody was taking pictures of you. They were photographing birthdays, volunteer days, school picnics. You just happened to be in every memory. Rachel slowly turned another photograph over. On the back, someone had written, Mr. Sam fixed the swing before Emma noticed it was broken. Another read, he paid for the replacement picnic table himself. A third simply said, he stayed until Dad finally smiled again. I looked up in confusion. I don't remember this. David answered quietly. They do. Just then, a small delivery truck stopped beside the pavilion. The driver climbed out, carrying 3 large canvas mailbags. Rachel hurried over to help. They're not supplies, she called back. What are they? She untied the first bag. Hundreds of handwritten envelopes spilled gently across one of the picnic tables. Every single one had my name written across the front. I took one uncertain step toward them, then stopped. Because for the first time since accepting this retirement ceremony, I realized the gathering had never been about saying goodbye. Someone had spent weeks quietly collecting stories I never knew anyone remembered. I had spent nearly 3 decades making certain the park remembered everyone else. Apparently, someone had been making certain the park remembered me. The canvas mailbags remained untouched on the picnic table while volunteers carefully counted chairs that had already become hopelessly inadequate. More vehicles continued arriving every few minutes. Families greeted one another like old neighbors, even when they had never met before. Somehow they all seemed connected by a place, a memory, and a man who had never realized he occupied either. Rachel picked up one envelope. "May I?" I nodded uncertainly. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a faded photograph of a little girl standing beneath a freshly planted oak tree. Written beneath it in careful handwriting were the words, "Mr. Sam said trees grow stronger when someone believes they'll still matter 50 years later." Rachel quietly turned the picture over. The date read 1998. "I remember her," I whispered. She cried because the sapling looked too small. "What happened?" Rachel smiled. "The letter says she's now a forest ranger." Before I could respond, another volunteer approached carrying a cardboard box filled with framed photographs. "They keep bringing these." I looked inside. Birthdays, scout meetings, family reunions, school field trips, community cleanups, different years, different faces. The same park, the same quiet figure somewhere in the background. Usually me. Never looking toward the camera, always repairing something. David Brooks leaned beside me. "You know what surprised me most?" "What?" "Nobody planned this together." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "These people found each other afterward." He explained that Rachel had originally announced a simple retirement gathering on the park's community bulletin board. Within days, someone posted an old photograph. Another family replied with a story. Then someone else remembered a different year. A veterans association shared another memory. Teachers contacted former students. Parents reached out to grown children. No single person knew the entire story. Each one only recognized one small piece. Together, they had uncovered something much larger. I stared across the growing crowd. So none of this was organized? Only the date. The gratitude organized itself. His answer settled deeply inside me. For years, I had believed every small act disappeared after it was finished. Apparently, they had been quietly connecting with one another long after I walked away. Rachel carried another envelope toward me. This one came from Colorado. I hesitated. "You read it." She unfolded the page. "Dear Mr. Sam, you probably don't remember teaching a stubborn 12-year-old how to repair a bicycle chain behind the maintenance shop. You told me broken things aren't failures. They simply need someone patient enough to understand them. I'm now a mechanical engineer. Every new employee hears that sentence during orientation." Rachel lowered the page slowly. "You really don't remember?" I searched my memory. Faces blurred together after 27 years. Only the work remained clear. "I remember the bicycle, not the boy." The realization hurt more than I expected. David rested one hand gently on my shoulder. "That's because you never helped people to be remembered. You helped because they needed it." Just then, an elderly woman approached carrying a weathered lunchbox. "I think this belongs in today's story." She opened it carefully. Inside lay dozens of small paper name tags, children's handwriting, volunteer badges, junior gardening club stickers. At the very bottom rested a tiny pair of faded work gloves. I looked at them in stunned silence. They matched the old children's gloves I had carried inside my maintenance bag for years. "I've been keeping the other pair," she whispered. "My son wore these the summer you convinced him he wasn't too small to help." Before I could answer, she gently placed the gloves into my hands. For the first time that morning, I realized hundreds of people had not come because I maintained a park. They had come because, without ever intending to, I had quietly helped them believe they mattered. The little pair of faded work gloves remained in my hands long after the elderly woman walked away. I turned them over slowly. The fabric had nearly worn through at the fingertips, and someone had carefully stitched one torn seam with blue thread years earlier. I recognized the repair immediately. I had sewn it myself. Not because the gloves were valuable, because the little boy who wore them had looked so disappointed when they ripped during a Saturday volunteer project. Apparently, I had remembered the gloves. I had forgotten the child. Rachel stood quietly beside me. "Do you know how many stories we've counted?" I shook my head. 143. "That's impossible." "No." She looked gently toward the growing crowd. "That's only how many people contacted us before today." The number settled heavily in my chest. I had never tried to change anyone's life. I had only tried to fix whatever needed fixing. Sometimes it was a broken gate. Sometimes it was a frightened child. Sometimes it was simply a lonely afternoon. Rachel hesitated before speaking again. "I think there's something you should see." She led me into the maintenance workshop. For nearly 3 decades, the building had been little more than my second home. Every shelf stood exactly where I had built it. Every tool rested where tired hands could find it without looking. Nothing had changed. Until I noticed the workbench. My old maintenance notebooks were stacked neatly across the center. I frowned. I thought those stayed in the storage cabinet. They did. Who moved them? I did. Rachel looked almost apologetic. "I'm sorry. I know you value your privacy. I only opened them because I couldn't understand something." She gently placed the oldest notebook before me. The pages contained routine entries: repaired fountain valve, replaced swing bearings, removed fallen oak branch. Nothing unusual. Then she opened another notebook from nearly 15 years later. Small notes had begun appearing beside the official maintenance records. Bought paint personally, budget delayed. Replaced sandbox cover, children's fundraiser shouldn't have to wait. Paid for new wheelchair-accessible picnic table hardware. Each expense carried only a dollar amount. Never a complaint. Never a request for reimbursement. Rachel looked at me carefully. "You never submitted these. They weren't city expenses. They should have been. Maybe. But the children needed the playground that week. The paperwork would have taken months." She turned another page. The same pattern continued year after year. Replacement lumber. Garden tools. Flower bulbs donated anonymously. Winter gloves for volunteer children. Lunch for teenagers working community cleanup days. Tiny amounts. Repeated hundreds of times. None large enough to attract attention. Together, they represented years of quiet sacrifice. "You spent your own retirement savings." I shrugged gently. I spent money. No. She closed the notebook. You invested in people. Before I could answer, David stepped into the workshop, carrying an envelope marked with the city seal. They're here. Who? The Parks Department. Rachel accepted the envelope and quickly read the contents. Her expression changed immediately. What happened? She looked toward me with obvious concern. They've approved today's ceremony. I thought that was good news. It is. She hesitated. But they've also expanded it. Expanded? The mayor is coming. I sighed quietly. I asked for a small goodbye. David nodded sympathetically. It isn't small anymore. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, I looked toward the maintenance notebook still lying open across the workbench. I don't want people applauding old receipts. Rachel smiled sadly. They aren't coming because you bought paint. Then why are they coming? She rested one hand on the worn notebook. Because every receipt represents someone you quietly chose before you chose yourself. Before I could answer, another volunteer hurried through the doorway. Rachel, what is it? They've run out of parking. I looked toward the workshop window. The entrance road had disappeared beneath an endless line of arriving cars. And for the first time that morning, I quietly wondered whether leaving before the ceremony began might be the kindest thing I could do for everyone. I quietly decided that I would leave before the ceremony began. It seemed like the simplest solution. If I slipped away while everyone gathered beneath the pavilion, Rachel could thank the volunteers, the mayor could shake a few hands, and the park itself would remain the center of attention where it belonged. That had always been enough for me. While the crowd continued growing outside, I folded my old maintenance apron, placed it carefully inside my locker, and began removing the few personal items that had accumulated over 27 years. One faded coffee mug, a pocket knife my army supervisor had given me decades earlier. The tiny pair of children's work gloves that had remained in my toolbox since the summer they had been forgotten. Nothing else. I had always believed that if you left a workplace with very little, it meant you had spent your years investing in the place instead of yourself. As I reached for my old canvas maintenance bag, Rachel quietly stepped into the workshop. You aren't coming. It wasn't a question. No. I thought you might do this. I don't belong on a stage. She leaned gently against the doorway. Do you know where everyone is right now? Waiting. She smiled softly. No. They're walking. Walking? They asked us not to start the ceremony. I looked at her with confusion. Why? They wanted to visit the places where they first met you. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Rachel continued quietly. The bridge, the butterfly garden, the baseball field, the little fishing dock, the old maple grove. They're retracing memories. I lowered my eyes toward the maintenance bag. I never planned any of that. I know. That's exactly why they're here. Before I could answer, David Brooks appeared carrying a large cork display board. It was already covered with photographs. More volunteers followed behind him, carrying another and another. Within minutes, the workshop walls had disappeared behind hundreds of images collected from nearly 3 decades. There was no pattern except one. No picture celebrated me. Every photograph celebrated someone else's happiness. A little girl riding a bicycle. An elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary beneath the gazebo. Scouts planting flowers, children catching their first fish, veterans sharing coffee after Memorial Day ceremonies. I appeared only in the background. Sweeping leaves, repairing fences, holding ladders, carrying lumber, working. Rachel pointed quietly toward one photograph taken almost 20 years earlier. Do you remember this family? I studied it carefully. A young father sat alone beside a picnic table while two small daughters played nearby. No. He had just lost his wife. I looked at Rachel in surprise. He came to the park every Saturday because he didn't know how to keep smiling for his girls. She gently touched the edge of the photograph. You never tried to comfort him. I didn't? No. You simply asked if the girls wanted help building a birdhouse. Slowly, another memory returned. Tiny hands covered in sawdust. 3 crooked birdhouses. A father laughing for the first time in weeks because his youngest daughter accidentally hammered her own shoelace to the workbench. I remember the birdhouses. Rachel nodded. He remembers surviving. The workshop became completely silent. For years, I had judged my work by things repaired. Apparently, everyone else remembered the people quietly restored while those repairs happened. Just then, the city maintenance supervisor hurried inside. Sam, what is it? We've got another problem. I sighed gently. I retired too early? He laughed. I wish. He handed Rachel an updated attendance list. She stared at the final number, then looked back at me. 512. I blinked. There can't be that many. There are. And they're still arriving. I slowly sat down on the old workshop stool. 512 people had not gathered because a groundskeeper was retiring. They had gathered because somehow hundreds of separate acts of unnoticed kindness had quietly become one shared story. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of applause. I was afraid I could never possibly deserve it. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 1 o'clock. At 12:30, the pavilion still stood empty. Not because no one had arrived, because no one wanted to sit down yet. Instead, more than 500 people quietly wandered through Riverside Memorial Park, retracing moments that had shaped their lives years before. No music played, no master of ceremonies called for attention. The park itself had become the program. Rachel walked slowly beside me as we followed the familiar maintenance trail toward the old butterfly garden. I've never seen anything like this. Neither have I. She smiled. That's because no one planned it. Children who had once planted flowers returned with children of their own. Retired teachers pointed toward trees that had once been tiny saplings during school field trips. Former scout leaders laughed while trying to remember which picnic table had collapsed before I quietly rebuilt it over a single weekend. Everywhere I looked, people were not remembering projects. They were remembering how those projects had made them feel. Near the fishing dock, a tall man in his 40s waited patiently until we approached. He extended his hand. I don't expect you to remember me. I've been wrong about that all morning. He smiled. My name is Marcus. You taught me how to sharpen a shovel. I searched my memory. Nothing came. Seeing my expression, he laughed warmly. I was 13. My mother had just passed away. The smile slowly faded from my face. I skipped school almost every day. I hid in this park because nobody asked questions. He looked toward the old tool shed across the field. You didn't lecture me. You handed me a shovel. You said every trail stays clear because somebody shows up before everyone else. Marcus looked down at his hands. I've worked for the State Forestry Service for 19 years. I still sharpen every shovel exactly the way you taught me. Before I could answer, another woman approached, carrying a framed newspaper clipping. My turn. The article showed volunteers rebuilding the community garden after a devastating spring flood. I barely remembered the project. She remembered every detail. My husband had just lost his job. We couldn't afford groceries. You quietly asked if we'd help restore the garden. She smiled through tears. Every volunteer took home vegetables that summer. You never told anyone that was your plan. The stories continued. One after another. Each person carried only one memory. None believed it was extraordinary. Together they formed a life I had never seen because I had been too busy living it. Rachel finally led me toward the maintenance workshop one last time. Inside, the walls had completely disappeared behind photographs. Below every picture hung one handwritten card. Not speeches, not praise, simple memories. He waited until my son stopped crying. She believed she could build it because he handed her the first hammer. He fixed the bench before my father came home from chemotherapy. He never told anyone. I stood silently in the center of the room. I don't deserve this. Rachel shook her head gently. None of these people came because you were perfect. They came because you were present. The sentence settled quietly inside me. For nearly 3 decades, I had measured success by work completed before sunset. Apparently, everyone else measured it by something entirely different. Outside, the church bell struck 1 o'clock. The retirement ceremony was supposed to begin. Instead, David Brooks stepped onto the pavilion stage carrying no microphone, only my old canvas maintenance bag. He held it up for everyone to see. Most people think this bag carried tools. He smiled toward the crowd. They're wrong. It carried opportunity. Silence spread naturally across the park. No announcement had been necessary. 500 people simply stopped walking at exactly the same moment. Every face turned toward the pavilion. Every conversation faded. David looked toward me. Sam. He smiled gently. I think it's finally time for you to see what all these people have been quietly carrying for you. Behind the stage curtain, volunteers began wheeling out dozens of large display boards covered entirely with photographs, letters, children's drawings, and handwritten stories collected from 27 years of quiet service. And only then did I realize the ceremony had never been created to honor one groundskeeper. It had been created to reveal the invisible community he had unknowingly built. When the first display board rolled onto the pavilion stage, the entire park fell silent. No one needed to ask for quiet. 500 people who had arrived from different towns, different generations, and different seasons of life somehow understood they were about to witness the same story from 500 different perspectives. David Brooks carefully set my old canvas maintenance bag beside the podium. Then he looked toward me. Sam, you spent 27 years carrying tools for everyone else. Today we'd like to show you what everyone else has been carrying for you. Rachel uncovered the first display board. Across the top, someone had written only 3 words. He showed up. Nothing more. Below those words stretched dozens of photographs. Children learning to plant trees, teenagers repainting picnic benches, families rebuilding flower beds after storms, veterans standing quietly beside newly raised flags. Every photograph captured an ordinary day. Every ordinary day had quietly become someone's unforgettable memory. Rachel invited the first speaker forward. To my surprise, it wasn't a city official. It was the elderly Marine I had noticed earlier that morning. He stopped beside the microphone but never looked at the audience. He looked at me. My wife passed away 14 years ago. I couldn't stay inside our house. So every Tuesday morning, I sat alone on the bench overlooking the pond. He smiled gently. You never asked me what was wrong. You simply replaced the loose board beneath my feet before I noticed it. A few people laughed softly. I realized later. You always repaired the bench before repairing me. He stepped away without another word. The second speaker was the young mother whose little boy wore oversized gardening gloves. She placed a small wooden birdhouse on the table beside the podium. My son was born with limited strength in one hand. I worried he would always believe other children could do things he never could. She looked toward me. You quietly made every tool in the workshop easier for him to hold. You never announced it. You simply changed the handles before he arrived. The little boy lifted the birdhouse proudly. I built this. The audience applauded. Not because of the birdhouse, because every parent understood what confidence had quietly been built alongside it. One story became another. A retired teacher described finding fresh flowers beside the memorial stone where her husband had served as a volunteer for years. A firefighter remembered arriving after a tornado to discover dangerous branches already cleared before emergency crews reached the park. A former scout leader admitted that dozens of children learned responsibility because I had trusted them with real work instead of pretending they were too young. No story sounded dramatic by itself. Together, they became overwhelming. Rachel finally unfolded the largest display board. It contained nothing except copies of handwritten notes from my maintenance journals. Not the expense records. The tiny reminders written in the margins. Remember Ethan's science fair tomorrow. Mrs. Alvarez prefers yellow tulips. Replace fishing dock railing before Veterans Day. Emma is finally smiling again. I stared silently at the familiar handwriting. I had forgotten writing most of those notes. Rachel smiled through tears. You thought you were keeping maintenance records. You were really keeping people. The sentence reached somewhere words rarely do. I looked across the crowd. 500 faces. 500 separate lives. 500 stories I had never intended to become part of. Slowly, I stepped toward the microphone. I've been trying all morning to decide whether I deserved any of this. I paused. I finally realized that's the wrong question. The audience remained perfectly still. If today only celebrates one groundskeeper, then all of this ends when I retire. I looked toward the young volunteers standing near the back. But if today reminds us that every community becomes stronger whenever ordinary people quietly take responsibility for someone else's tomorrow, then none of this belongs to me. I turned toward Rachel. What was that name you suggested for the volunteer program? She smiled. Quiet Hands Initiative. I nodded. Then let that be today's celebration. Not my retirement. Their beginning. The applause that followed no longer felt directed toward one man. It sounded like an entire community accepting responsibility for carrying forward everything quiet service had taught them. 1 year later, Riverside Memorial Park looked almost exactly the way it always had. The walking trails remained clean. The flower gardens bloomed on schedule. The playground echoed with children's laughter every afternoon. The fishing dock still welcomed quiet conversations at sunrise. Most visitors never noticed anything had changed. That was exactly how Samuel Carter would have wanted it. He no longer unlocked the maintenance workshop every morning before dawn. His knees had finally persuaded him to slow down, and retirement had gently become real. Still, on the first Saturday of every month, he quietly walked through the park, carrying the same old canvas maintenance bag. The tools inside had changed. There were fewer wrenches, more gardening gloves, extra seed packets, small notebooks, and always one pair of children's work gloves waiting for whoever arrived, eager to help. The Quiet Hands initiative had grown beyond anything Rachel Morgan imagined. Every weekend, volunteers of every generation gathered before sunrise. Some repaired picnic tables, some planted flowers, others quietly visited elderly residents who could no longer enjoy the park without assistance. No one wore shirts with Sam's name. No statue stood near the entrance. No building carried his dedication. Instead, every volunteer wore a simple patch stitched onto one sleeve. A pair of open hands beneath a small oak tree. Nothing more. One spring afternoon, I found Sam sitting on the same bench overlooking the pond where so many stories had quietly begun. He watched a group of children repainting birdhouses under the guidance of 2 college students who had once learned woodworking from him years earlier. "They don't need me anymore," he said softly. I smiled. "I think you've misunderstood." He looked toward the children. "They've never needed me. They needed someone to begin." For a long moment we watched without speaking. One little girl accidentally dropped her paintbrush. Before any adult moved, another child picked it up, cleaned it carefully, and handed it back with a smile. No one praised the gesture. No one announced it. Kindness had simply become normal. Sam noticed it too. He laughed quietly. "That's better than any retirement gift." A few minutes later, Rachel joined us carrying a small wooden box. Inside rested hundreds of handwritten cards submitted by volunteers during the past year. Each card answered one simple question. Who quietly showed up for you? Teachers, neighbors, parents, nurses, coaches, veterans, friends. None of the answers mentioned famous people. Nearly every story celebrated someone whose kindness had once seemed ordinary. Sam gently closed the box. "I spent years thinking maintenance meant fixing broken things." He looked toward the volunteers. "It turns out maintenance also means protecting what is already good before anyone notices it's disappearing." As the afternoon sun settled across Riverside Memorial Park, a young boy wearing oversized work gloves hurried past, carrying a toolbox almost too heavy for him. Another volunteer reached out to help. The boy smiled politely. "I've got it." Then he added words that made Sam's eyes quietly fill with tears. "Mister." Sam said someone trusted him before he believed in himself. I want to do that for somebody else. If this story reminded you that the quietest acts of service often leave the deepest mark, I hope you'll look for one small opportunity to help someone today without expecting recognition. The repair you make, the encouragement you offer, or the time you freely give may become part of another person's story long after they forget your name. May your hands quietly strengthen your community. Your kindness inspire those who come after you, and your legacy live not in monuments, but in the people who continue the work you began.